This is Que Esperanzas, a new series on Book Public from Texas Public Radio. The expression Que Esperanzas is an ironic or pessimistic interjection meant to convey there's little hope and the improbability of success. Book Public's Que Esperanzas series focuses on short stories with protagonists who are women surviving catastrophic injustices in their everyday lives and facing them with a thin measure of hope. This week's story is Because That's Just Easier by Dana Johnson. Protagonist Frida is worried about her daughter Dakota and her fear of the outside world on the streets of Los Angeles. They live in a high-rise away from the homeless people who live on the streets that they must traverse in their everyday lives. Dakota is sensitive, watchful, thoughtful. Her own perspective influences the way Frida sees the world. Frida learns that maybe she's done too much to avoid the outside world in her own ways and deny the reality of what goes on out there because, as the title of the story tells us, maybe it's just easier that way. Or is it? Here's Dana Johnson.
Because that's just easier. Their kid was turning weird. She refused to go outside unless she was in a car. Overnight, this seemed to be the case. She didn't want to walk. She didn't want to walk out of the front door of their loft, walk down the hall, get in the elevator, walk out of the elevator, and then walk 10 paces onto the street and out into the world. No, she'd get to the door and dig in, screaming and wailing as if she'd lost her mind. The last thing that used to work to get the child out of the house no longer worked. Cupcakes. That was all it used to take. I bet they have the red velvet today, Frida would say. Come on, sweetie, you're with me. I'm not gonna let anything happen to you. But the last time they did that, just 2 days ago, a man wearing a blazer with no shirt lunged at them, muttering something about Jesus and the devil. Devil, he kept saying, devil. When he said it, it sounded like devil. Give me some sugar, he demanded. He was holding onto the waist of his pants, which had a rope as a belt. His black blazer was so dirty that parts of it glistened in the sunlight. Something like lipstick was smeared on his cheeks, and his long hair stood out at the ends so that he looked like some deranged scarecrow. He lunged at them with his big hands, near enough to see the length of the nails and the blackness underneath them, and she jerked Dakota's body against her own. But the man was no longer interested in them. He'd suddenly changed course like some prop monster in a carnival ride. He walked on, muttering, and everyone on the street who saw him walked past him, eyes fixed on other things. In front of their building, Dakota begged to be taken back upstairs. I don't have any sugar, she wailed. And when Frida tried to calm her down, one of Dakota's bony knees caught her in the chin. Cupcakes were no longer going to cut it.
For our listeners who maybe haven't read the story yet, can you give us just a quick summary of the story?
It's a story about a couple who has decided to move to downtown Los Angeles with their child. And because they live near Skid Row, they're having to figure out how to live there with a small child. And the mother in particular is reckoning with the cost of raising a child in the middle of such poverty and chaos amid sort of the unhoused population of Los Angeles.
And I think people don't realize that that's where Skid Row is. And our characters of Frida and Jackson and Dakota are living in a high rise, sort of high above all of that that's going on down in the streets. And so it's just such an interesting juxtaposition of spaces as we see. And, one would think, well, it does seem like some upward mobility for anybody to be able to live there. And yet there's just such a fine line between where they're living and the kind of life that they have, and and really something that I think is dictated by their own careers, Jackson and Frida, and then what's going on sort of down in the rest of the world. It's such an interesting thing that you do with place in the story.
Yeah, I mean, there is that duality of living in the city and particularly downtown. I love it. I still live down here and I love it because of everything that's around me, that's our central library, one of the most beautiful libraries to me in the world is here. Disney Hall, theaters, Dodger Stadium is just up the street, and so there is this attraction to a space like this downtown, and yet we are living together with folks who obviously don't have the privilege of living as we live in the spaces that we live, going to bars with $16 cocktails and restaurants and all of that. And so there is always that negotiation of sort of living in a space like this and witnessing, frankly, the ways in which we are letting our fellow humans down
Yeah.
without the ability to see, without understanding or having the ability to know how to solve this huge problem. So yeah, that living in that duality of, living in a fairly nice space here downtown, among folks who don't have that's been a difficult space to be in ever since I've lived down here. So I wanted to write about that.
And I see it's the frustration and the worry of Frida is so palpable here because this is something that she cannot fix for her little child. I mean, it's for as much as she tries to think of ways to bring Dakota out, with a cupcake or an ice cream, to bring her out to go through this, step by step process. You go to the elevator, you go down, and all of these steps to get her. I mean, she seems like she could be not agoraphobic, but just have that fear of just being in that space, um, down below in the streets. And it feels like almost emblematic for Frida of so many things that she won't be able to fix for her child. She will not have that. She doesn't have that sense of control. Maybe even in her relationship with her husband, as we sort of are seeing all these things sort of um, being chipped away at, and these tensions. And they seem to come in this particular story from this fear that the child has, that then is something that Frida is absorbing as, all of the things she cannot fix, all of the things that she won't be able to fix.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fine line between, one has to live one's life. The world is as it is. And in some ways, I think, Frida's husband thinks that they're doing their child a disservice if they try to raise her in this sort of sanitized Disneyland-like life. But for Frida, there's trauma in seeing people on the streets with nothing, suffering through their mental illness or drug disorder, drug use disorder, drug abuse. That is something that works not only on a child, but on an adult. And so what is the balance between sort of, not trying to live in denial,
Mhm.
but also trying to save your child from traumatic experiences? There's a balance there. And she's trying to figure that out in the story.
And even inside their space, the space where the three of them are in this, what seems like such a lovely home, um, is there's these elements of like the comic books that Jackson likes to read, the zombie movies, and then so like there are these kinds of introductions to, to horrible things sort of right there too that Frida is afraid of, and how to shield Dakota even from that. And this is something that Jackson would like to share with Frida, like, watch this show with me about the zombies, and she can
Right.
really stand to watch the show. But it again, it just seems like for Frida, even inside, we see like again, like the signs of things to come, the types of things that she won't be able to shield her child from very easily with the internet and so on, and with television. Things are just there in full view. And I like that line where Jackson points the remote and it's, as if it were a magic wand and it vanishes. If only it were a magic wand, right? So there's all of this sort of that's building up the tension in the story, even inside the home space. It's so interesting to me.
I was thinking about, and of course, obviously, I'm not the first person to think about this, but sort of the normalization of violence and the kind of the numbing that comes with that.
Mhm.
So that if one is constantly watching violence, fake as it is, uh, and blood and guts and gore, um, to be able to watch that unflinchingly means, to my mind, that of course you've gotten used to that or you've accepted that. And and so again, that's what Frida is struggling against. She doesn't think that that's normal, fake or not, TV or not, film or not. It's not something that one should watch and then just sort of normalize. And again, she and her husband have very different philosophies about this. And and so I was thinking about that in their home, she's struggling with this. And then also down below on the streets, she's struggling with this of, you know, which is better? Is it better just to normalize it so that we can get through our day and go get our cupcakes and go to the library and do what we need to do? Or is that the tragedy of normalizing that so that you're able to go about your day, which is worse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does. And so when the family does go out there for their walk in the story, we, along with them, encounter the worst of Dakota's, nightmares, or even Frida's, where they are approached by these homeless men. And we can see how, at least for Frida, she begins to align in her own mind the zombies from the TV show that she could not look at. It's on in full view. She looks away from it. And then outside, she would like to look away from it and make sure that Dakota doesn't see it. But Dakota is seeing it. Dakota is able to see it. They've come out of the house almost as a form of practicing with her so she can get over her fear of
Mhm.
being outside in that space. It's just such a powerful, powerful scene where everything seems to be going okay. They're on their way to get a treat, and then just the worst possible thing happens. And then what we really see is Frida's reaction. We're sort of seeing how Dakota is so sensitive and so watchful, and that seems to influence Frida's perspective. I mean, not just as a protective parent, but like now it feels like she's seeing the zombie movie through the eyes of her child, or seeing the outside world, sort of from that vantage point. And it's something so heartrending in a way that what it does is it inspires her with fear. I mean, she's frozen for a second there and doesn't really know what to do. It's just a very powerful thing, and it's so complicated. The idea of homelessness, as you say, of mental illness, of drug addiction, of so many things that need to be taken into account beyond they're like zombies. He's these sort of negative characterizations that people can so offhandedly apply because it's easy, right? Or it's because it's convenient and we can look away for a little while and not have to think about it. But it's there in full view, and it's always there in terms of it's right outside their front door.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's interesting. Frida is so struggling to maintain in front of her child. And a little kind of like there's a dynamic shift there where Dakota is she's so determined. Her little mind is, she sees her mom is struggling at some point. Her mom, Dakota, says, "You're squeezing my hand really hard," and Dakota in that moment just becomes this person that's just like, all right, I know I'm a little kid, but I'm just going to get through this too. And so they're both trying to negotiate this in very different ways. And what I tried to do in those moments is, Dakota, because she's aware of the zombie movies and all of that, and she's seeing sort of like the mechanical mannerisms of the homeless people or person they encounter, she makes that connection. But what I was trying to suggest is that what becomes of us, the supposed living, who can just sort of walk without feeling, without looking, without understanding, without heart, right? There's a kind of zombification that happens to us when we live this way, to become kind of heartless and numb in order to survive seeing fellow humans live this way. Yeah. It's not fair, it's not right, it's not just, it shouldn't be happening. And yet I've got to get myself to the train station, to the Metro link, and somehow be okay with seeing what it is that I'm seeing on a daily basis. How do I do that? There's a way of like somehow kind of shutting down a little bit. And so what I'm asking is like, like, who is the zombie exactly in this story? Who are the zombies? It's a tough thing.
That's so interesting that it was Frida that's holding on to Dakota's hand so tightly that it hurts her, and it's Frida that's holding on. It's not the other way around.
Right.
And it's such an, as you say, it's such a flip in the dynamic between the two of them, and it seems to have done something very subtle in terms of how Dakota is now managing. And once they're back home, and she talks about how they were sort of pushing her toward a certain kind of toy, and maybe not the girly girl Barbie stuff, but just Dakota just has her own mind about it. And I come to this point in the story, and I think, of course, at that moment where Frida is reacting so strongly to what they're seeing, Dakota is doing her best to manage it. And once they get home, and it's sort of the more they try to force certain things on her, the more she's going to manage it just according to her own sense of herself.
Yeah.
It's something really interesting that happens in that part of the story.
I feel like, as I don't have children, but I feel like at some point, lots of kids have this understanding sometimes, well, my parents, they're just people too. And so at some point, if they're not understanding me or getting me or helping me in the ways that I need help, you figure things out on your own, even as little people,
Yeah.
You become who you become because of what you're experiencing. And so I imagine that at some point, because her mom seems very fragile surrounding this, and her dad isn't being very helpful, and he's just saying it is what it is, and you need to understand that people live this way, that at a certain point, little Dakota comes up with her own solution, right? That she's not being helped in the ways that she needs to be helped, and so she helps herself. And she just becomes all right with it at a certain point.
Yes, and she gets sort of the last word in the story about it, and it's such an important idea. Um, there's this short story by Oscar Casares where this kid works in a fireworks stand. He's just like 10 years old, but he's privy to all of the things that the owner of the fireworks stand does. And he's really a very contemptible, terrible person. And at the end, the boy really wants to quit the job, but he's afraid of the dad, and he's afraid of what the dad will say. And on and on, it's all of these dramatic things happen. And at the end, the dad says, "How's it going?" And the boy says, "Oh, everything's great." And the dad says, "See, I told you things would get better."
Mm,
And the fact is they didn't get better, but the boy learned how to play the game of this kind of, terrible man.
yeah.
um, and it's such a, to me, that's such a sad story of, of the boy is growing up to be more like this terrible boss than like his dad who he's trying to please. Um, but in this story, I think in terms of like the last line, again, it's like in that other story, things didn't get better. But in this story, I feel like, you know, Dakota understands something very critical. Um, and, this is the way that we live. This is the way that we sort of grow up. Our innocence is chipped away all the time. We see our parents arguing, or we realize that, there are people in the world who don't have a home and who have diseases and who can't be helped. And, things start chipping away at our innocence and at our understanding of the world. And at a certain point, we still, as children, I think, have to find a way to live through it, and, and to negotiate those spaces. It's such a hard lesson. I mean, it's such
Yeah.
a dramatic moment in the story. But I also feel like it's something that Frida, and Jackson too, to a certain extent, that Frida is living through her child as a parent.
Yeah. I mean, I think Frida is trying to retain that innocence that you talk about and raise a healthy child. And so you know, she's, I mean, she's trying to maintain her own mental health too, right? And her own frame of mind. And so she and Dakota are sort of symbiotic in that way. Um, but yeah, you were talking about how kids learn these hard lessons, and a lot of it comes at us through ways in which even our own parents don't understand. And so that little section about, they tried really hard to raise her with sort of like gender-free toys or whatever, but kids take in what they take in. You can insist or try and insist on a certain way for your child, but they're going to like what they like. They're going to be interested in what they're interested in. And in spite of themselves, they might even take in things that they resist. There's no telling. There's a weird alchemy of kind of the world and what lands on the psyche of a person, particularly of a child. And so it's the same with, they're trying to make her not be so much into Barbie and those kinds of toys, but she ends up liking those things anyway. And Frida is trying to protect her child from sort of the harshness of the world. And yet by the end of the story, as a way to survive, Dakota has sort of taken on some of that harshness of the world and has become hardened in her own little way to the suffering of others outside that apartment, because that's just easier, right? So I wanted to talk about those complications and how basically so much of everything is out of our control, and how does one then try to regain control, and at what cost?
Dana Johnson, thank you so much for talking to me about this story. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Dana Johnson is the author of the story Because That's Just Easier. It can be found in her collection of stories titled In the Not Quite Dark. This has been Que Esperanzas, a series focusing on short stories with protagonists who are women surviving catastrophic injustices in their everyday lives, on Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. We had help this week from David Martin Davies. I'm Yvette Benavides.